My Lords, it's a great pleasure to follow the Noble Lord, Lord Teverson, and I rise chiefly to speak to Amendment 292 that appears in my name, also with the backing of the Noble Lady Baroness Boycott, the Noble Lady Baroness Meacher, and the Noble Lord, Lord Hunt of King's Heath, and I thank them all for their support and note that a number of other Noble Lords would have signed this amendment had there been space. I was simply going to speak to that, but I really do have to just briefly strongly commend Amendment 119, so ably moved by the Noble Lady Baroness Jones of Whitchurch. The Noble Lord, Lord Teverson highlighted in a previous group how I'd focused on the word urgent a lot, and I think with this amendment, the Noble Lady Baroness Jones has really driven to the need for the urgency of action. We have a plastic and waste-choked planet and nation, and it really cannot take more. It cannot take the volumes that we're putting onto it every day now. However, I'm going to chiefly speak to Amendment 292, which is about nappies. And that might sound perhaps like a small, minor issue, but I hope by the time I finish, Noble Lords will understand that's not the case. Before I begin, I should perhaps declare my position as Vice President of the Local Government Association, since that will become relevant. And I will also declare, for full transparency, that I've worked on this amendment and many Noble Lords will have received briefings from the Nappy Alliance, which does represent makers of reusable nappies. Supporting a green industry, working with them is not something I'm going to make any apologies for, but I think it's important that we acknowledge such ties and where the resources come from. So to single-use or disposable nappies. Each nappy on average generates 550 kilos of carbon dioxide in its production and then disposal through its whole life cycle. From birth to ending using of nappies, an average child will use the equivalent of 15,000 plastic bags and half a tree in fluff. Around, and this is why the Local Government Association is relevant, at a local level, single-use nappies are about 4% of residual waste in England. That's each year 3 billion nappies, and it costs local authorities £600 billion a year to dispose of them. When they're sent to landfill, it takes 300 years. I was just thinking I should count the generations, roughly 12 generations for a nappy to break down. And when they're incinerated, there are, of course, significant carbon emissions and local air pollution levels, something we keep coming back to. And this is where this amendment links up with the Noble Lord, Lord Bradshaw's, because single-use nappies often end up contaminating waste for recycling because of misleading labels and consumer confusion. Many people don't realise that they contain plastic, they think they're kind of paper. By contrast, if we look at reusable nappies, they use 98% fewer raw materials and generate 99% less waste. They save the equivalent of 17 plastic bags per day. And I think I really need to dispel some misunderstandings, because there has been, as we've seen in many other areas of health and environment where there are powerful industry interests, there's been a lot of confusion and a lot of misunderstanding about environmental impacts and comparative environmental impacts. And in March 2021, in a report I'd be happy to share with any Noble Lord interested, the United Nations Environment Programme published a report, a comparison between single-use and reusables. It concluded that reusable nappies had lower environmental impacts across almost all trial scenarios when compared to single-use nappies. Now, Michael Gove seems to keep coming up a lot this evening. Back in 2018, he did actually suggest that disposable nappies might be banned. Now, on a very rare occurrence, so I'm not going to go as far as Michael Gove did in 2018, I do think occasionally when people are travelling or when there's a new babysitter or something, there may be a very occasional argument for the occasional use of single-use nappies. But that should not be the norm, which gets me to some other parts of this amendment that really start to address how we change this situation. Because there are some really good practical schemes in local authorities at a small scale that are helping people change over to reusable nappies, get away from single-use nappies. Often they're based on nappy libraries, often run by volunteers, most usually women, who have a range of nappies that families can try out, can see which one suits them before they make the layout of putting out the money. We also have many local authorities, but by no means all and by no means extensively, offer schemes that can help families that need it with the purchase of reusable nappies. Because the problem is, of course, that when you have a new baby, a growing baby, you need a set of nappies. That's a big outlay initially, and that's just beyond the reach of many people. So what we have here is proposals in this amendment to allow the Secretary of State, and I'm talking about subsection 8 here, to make regulations for a levy to be paid by those who make nappies to fund a scheme to help people use reusable nappies. So we're talking about ensuring people can afford to buy them, that they have access to understanding and knowledge, because what nappy libraries also do is very much share information about how to use nappies, what the best ones are to choose. And I think there's a comparison here. The Noble Lord Teverson talked about energy labels on packaging, and that's partly what's being called for in this amendment. But also what we're talking about is a bit like labels on cigarette packets, so that we have labelling and payment that acknowledges the cost of the product that's applied on all of us. So I really strongly wish to commend this amendment to the Noble Lord the Minister. And I would point out that I think I've probably been approached by more Noble Lords in your Lordship's House on this amendment than any other single amendment I've put down. And, I have put down some that have some very wide-reaching effects. But this is of great interest to people for many reasons. But one of them is, of course, something I'm sure we'll be referring to a lot in the next few hours, that of litter. And there is a big problem with litter from single-use nappies. It is a deeply unpleasant thing. I'm sure most people in your Lordship's House have been volunteer litter pickers in some form or another. It's not a pleasant thing to encounter when doing that. What we're talking about here is changing to make life better. And this is, I'll conclude by noting that we're talking here about the kind of systems thinking that I'm very often referring to, because the final point to make is that this is also, we're talking about the Environment Bill, and when we're talking about environment, people often say, oh, but can we afford the cost of this measure or that measure? Well, if we can help most families use single-use nappies, it's an average saving to a family of £11 a week. £11 a week, my lords, is a lot of money to very many families. Money that could go into healthier food, money that would take some of the stress and the pressure off. What we have here is an amendment that has environmental, social benefits. It's a win-win. So I'd suggest the Noble Lord has been pressured to offer some yeses. Here's an easy win for the Noble Lord.